It's amazing how we tend to view nature, like in these isolated snapshots, right? A polar bear alone on an ice floe, or an eagle soaring high above a mountain.
Yeah, totally. But the reality is much more interconnected, isn't it?
Exactly. And the chapter really drives this home with that image of the Arctic fox in the Alaskan tundra.
Oh, yeah, the one where its actions end up impacting plant life on islands miles away.
Right. Just by preying on seabirds, the fox is indirectly affecting vegetation growth. It links together ocean fish, island plants. It's incredible how it ripples out.
It highlights that web of connections that makes up an ecosystem, everything influencing everything else. And that's what we're really going to untangle today.
Exactly. This deep dive is all about understanding those dynamics,
The energy flow, the cycling of chemicals.
the interactions between organisms and their environment.
Hmm.
We're basically taking a deep dive into this whole chapter on ecosystems.
We're going to break down the science behind how these systems work, drawing directly from the chapter's research and examples.
So we'll be looking at energy, how it enters an ecosystem, how it gets transferred between organisms, and where it goes.
We'll also cover the cycling of matter, those essential elements like carbon and nitrogen that get used and reused by life.
And we'll explore how these systems can get disrupted and even how we can try to repair them through things like restoration ecology.
It's a pretty fascinating field.
Definitely. So to kick things off, the chapter starts with concept 55.1, which lays out some fundamental principles about ecosystems.
This is like the groundwork, the foundation for understanding how these complex systems operate.
Right. So first up, we have the flow of energy and the cycling of chemicals. These are like the two pillars of how life on Earth sustains itself.
Exactly. It all starts with energy.
And the chapter ties this directly to the laws of thermodynamics.
You know those laws from physics? They're actually incredibly relevant to biology as well.
Yeah. The first law basically tells us that energy can't be created or destroyed. It can only change forms.
So like sunlight being converted into chemical energy by plants during photosynthesis.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
But then things get a bit more nuanced with the second law, right?
Exactly. This one says that every time energy is transformed, some of it is lost as heat.
So it's not a perfectly efficient transfer.
Right. Think about a plant capturing sunlight. Not all of that energy gets passed on to the animal that eats the plant.
Some of it gets used by the plant itself for growth and metabolism.
And some is inevitably lost as heat, increasing the entropy of the universe.
This is why a constant input of energy is so crucial for ecosystems. Usually that input is sunlight. Without that influx, the whole system would wind down. It's this one-way flow of energy.
Now, in contrast to energy, matter behaves quite differently.
It's all about recycling, right?
Yeah. We have the law of conservation of mass. The total amount of each element in a closed system remains constant.
And while ecosystems aren't perfectly closed, the principle still holds true.
Exactly. Matter is constantly being recycled, changing forms, and moving between different parts of the ecosystem.
The chapter even suggests we imagine tracking a single carbon atom.
Oh yeah, that's a great visualization. Picture it starting as CO2 in the atmosphere.
Then it gets absorbed by a plant during photosynthesis and becomes part of a leaf.
Maybe a caterpillar munches on that leaf and the carbon becomes part of its body.
Then a bird swoops down, eats the caterpillar, and now that carbon is in the bird.
And eventually the bird dies and decomposes, or maybe it exhales CO2 and the carbon goes back to the atmosphere. It's this constant cycle.
Okay, so we've talked about energy and matter, but what exactly are we referring to when we say ecosystem?
It's all about the community of organisms living in a particular area.
And that includes not just the living things, but also the non-living components of their environment.
Right. It's that interaction between the biotic and abiotic factors that defines an ecosystem.
And ecosystems can be huge, like a vast forest.
Or tiny, like a little pond in your backyard.
The scale can vary quite a bit. The chapter even makes a point that the boundaries of ecosystems aren't always clear-cut.
They can blend into each other, and even the whole biosphere could be considered one giant interconnected ecosystem.
Now, within an ecosystem, organisms are classified based on how they obtain energy, right?
Right. We have the producers, also called autotrophs. They're the ones who can make their own food.
Like plants and algae using sunlight for photosynthesis.
Exactly. But there are also these fascinating chemotrophs.
They don't need sunlight.
Nope. They get their energy from inorganic chemicals. It's pretty amazing.
And then we have the consumers, also known as heterotrophs.
They can't make their own food, so they have to rely on others for energy.
And this includes everything from herbivores that eat plants to carnivores that eat other animals.
And we can't forget the decomposers. They're kind of the unsung heroes of the ecosystem.
What do?
They break down dead organic matter like fallen leaves and animal carcasses.
Oh yeah, they're the recyclers.
Exactly. They release nutrients back into the soil, making them available for the producers. It's a vital role.
The chapter gives a good example of this with a forest ecosystem.
You have the trees producing energy through photosynthesis.
Then their leaves fall to the ground and become food for the decomposers.
And those decomposers release nutrients back into the soil, which then get taken up by the trees again. It's a beautiful cycle.
So this brings us to the idea of trophic levels, right?
Essentially, the different feeding positions in an ecosystem.
It's like a hierarchy of who eats whom.
Yeah. So you have the producers at the bottom, the first trophic level.
And you have the herbivores that eat the producers. They're the primary consumers at the second trophic level.
And then the carnivores that eat the herbivores. They're the secondary consumers at the third trophic level.
And so on and so forth. You can have tertiary consumers and even quaternary consumers depending on the ecosystem.
Now, it's super important to remember that ecosystems aren't closed systems.
They're constantly exchanging both energy and matter with their surroundings.
Right. They receive energy mainly from the sun and nutrients from various sources.
And they release heat as a byproduct of metabolic processes and also expel waste products.
It's this dynamic exchange that keeps the ecosystem functioning.
And finally, for this concept, the chapter introduces the idea of nutrient limitation.
It's this idea that the availability of certain essential elements can actually restrict the productivity of an ecosystem.
So even if there's plenty of sunlight and water, if a certain nutrient is scarce, it can become a bottleneck for growth.
Right. And if the rate of nutrient loss from an ecosystem exceeds the rate of replenishment, then that nutrient will become a limiting factor.
Interesting. It's like a delicate balance.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so moving on to concept 55.2, the chapter delves into primary production in more detail.
This is all about how energy is captured and converted into organic matter within an ecosystem.
Essentially the foundation of the food web.
Right. So primary production is defined as the amount of light energy converted to chemical energy by autotrophs over a given time period.
And this includes both photosynthesis and chemosynthesis, right?
Exactly. But on a global scale, photosynthesis is the dominant process.
The chapter mentions this idea of a global energy budget.
Yeah. It turns out that only about 1% of the solar energy that reaches Earth actually gets captured by photosynthetic organisms.
That seems really low.
It does, but even with that tiny percentage, we're talking about a massive amount of energy.
How much?
Well, annually, it translates to about 150 billion metric tons of organic material produced globally.
Wow, that's a huge number.
Now, when we talk about primary production, it's important to distinguish between gross primary production, GPC, and net primary production, NPP.
I remember struggling with these terms in college. What's the difference again?
Well, GPP is the total amount of energy captured by producers.
Okay.
But producers also need energy for their own respiration and maintenance.
Right.
So NPP is what's left over after that. It's the energy that's actually stored as organic matter and available to consumers.
I see. So GPP is like your gross income, and NPP is your take-home pay.
Exactly. It's the energy that's actually usable by the rest of the ecosystem.
And this NPP can be measured in two ways, right?
Yeah. We can look at it as the rate of energy storage per unit area over time.
Or as the rate of biomass accumulation, basically the dry weight of new organic matter added over time.
Now, it's crucial to understand that MPP isn't the same as the standing biomass of an ecosystem.
Which is basically the total amount of organic matter present at a given time.
Right. A mature forest might have a lot of standing biomass, but its NPP could actually be lower than a grassland that's rapidly growing.
Because the grassland is producing new biomass at a faster rate.
Exactly.
The chapter also talks about net ecosystem production, or NEP.
This one takes into account all the respiration in an ecosystem, not just from the producers, but also from the consumers and decomposers.
So it's a measure of the total amount of carbon being stored or released by the ecosystem.
Precisely. If NEP is positive, it means the ecosystem is storing more carbon than it's releasing.
So it's acting as a carbon sink.
Exactly. But if NEP is negative, it means the ecosystem is releasing more carbon than it's storing.
A carbon source.
Exactly. And scientists can actually estimate NEP by measuring the flux of carbon dioxide or oxygen in and out of an ecosystem.
So what determines this primary production? What factors limit it?
Well, it varies between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems.
In aquatic systems, light is a big one, right?
Absolutely. As you go deeper in water, less and less light penetrates.
So photosynthesis becomes limited to the upper layers.
Exactly. It's called the photic zone.
Interestingly, the chapter points out that NPP isn't always highest at the equator.
Where you'd think there'd be the most sunlight.
Right. So clearly, light isn't the only factor at play,
In many cases, nutrients are the limiting factor.
especially nitrogen and phosphorus.
Yeah, they're often in short supply in the surface waters of oceans and lakes.
And why is that?
Well, phytoplankton, the microscopic algae, quickly use them up.
Plus, when organic matter sinks, it carries those nutrients down to the deeper layers.
Exactly. And this can lead to a problem called eutrophication.
Oh, right, when excess nutrients from things like agricultural runoff or sewage get into the water.
Exactly. It can cause huge algal blooms, which initially seems like a good thing because it increases GPP.
But then when those algae die and decompose, they use up all the oxygen in the water,
Creating those dreaded dead zones.
which are basically areas where most marine life can't survive.
It's a big problem in many coastal areas. The chapter actually highlights a study from Long Island Sound that clearly demonstrates nitrogen limitation.
And it's not just nitrogen and phosphorus that can be limiting.
Right. Sometimes micronutrients like iron can also play a crucial role.
The chapter mentions the Sargasso Sea as an example where iron is the limiting nutrient,
And in freshwater lakes, phosphorus is often the main culprit.
especially with all the phosphorus runoff from fertilizers and sewage.
Now shifting gears to terrestrial ecosystems.
What are the main factors limiting primary production on land?
Well, at a broad scale, it's all about temperature and moisture.
So warmer and wetter environments tend to be more productive,
Exactly. That's why tropical rainforests are so incredibly lush,
but deserts and tundra are much less productive.
because they're either too dry or too cold.
But nutrients still play a role on land, right?
Absolutely. Nitrogen and phosphorus are often limiting factors in terrestrial ecosystems as well.
The chapter gives a fascinating example of the impact of introducing Arctic foxes to some Alaskan islands.
Oh yeah, that one's a classic.
By preying on seabirds, the foxes actually reduced the amount of nutrient-rich guano getting into the soil.
Which surprisingly caused a shift from grasslands to less productive tundra vegetation.
Because the guano was a major source of nitrogen and phosphorus.
Exactly. And when researchers fertilized the tundra with those nutrients, the grasslands came back.
It really shows the power of nutrient limitation.
The chapter also mentions how plants have evolved various adaptations to enhance nutrient uptake.
Like forming symbiotic relationships with nitrogen-fixing bacteria.
Or with mycorrhizal fungi that extend the reach of their roots.
And they can even release enzymes to liberate nutrients from the soil.
Pretty clever. Now, before we move on, we should also touch on climate change and its impact on NPP.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Initially, some studies suggested that climate change might lead to increased NPP in some areas.
Because of factors like increased CO2 levels.
Right. But more recent research is painting a less optimistic picture.
What's changing?
Well, it seems that increased droughts, wildfires, and outbreaks of pests like bark beetles are now outweighing any potential benefits.
So we're actually seeing declines in NPP in many regions.
That's right. And this can even shift ecosystems from being carbon sinks to carbon sources.
Which would further accelerate climate change.
It's a worrying trend for sure.
Okay, so let's move on to concept 55.3, which explores how energy is transferred between trophic levels.
We've talked about primary production, but what happens to that energy as it moves up the food chain?
Right. Not all of it gets passed on, does it?
Definitely not. And that's where the concept of secondary production comes in.
So what is that exactly?
It's the amount of energy in a consumer's food that's converted into their own new biomass.
Basically how efficiently they're turning their food into more of themselves.
Right. And a key point here is that not all the energy from the food gets assimilated.
Meaning?
Well, some of it gets lost as heat during respiration.
Some is used for basic bodily functions.
And some passes through the digestive system undigested.
So how do we measure this efficiency?
The chapter introduces the concept of production efficiency.
Which is calculated as the percentage of energy assimilated that becomes new biomass.
Exactly. The caterpillar example they give is a good illustration.
It turns out that only about a third of the energy the caterpillar consumes actually goes towards growth and reproduction.
The rest is lost.
Now, interestingly, production efficiency varies significantly between different types of organisms.
Endothermic animals like birds and mammals have really low production efficiencies.
Only 1 to 3%.
Yeah. They use a lot of energy to maintain their body temperature.
Ectothermic animals like fish Are more efficient, around 10%,
And insects and microorganisms can be even more efficient.
up to 40% or higher.
Pretty impressive.
Now, when we look at energy transfer between trophic levels, we talk about trophic efficiency.
This takes into account all the energy lost, not just through respiration and waste, but also the energy that's not even consumed in the first place.
Unlike all the grass in a field that doesn't get eaten by the cows.
Exactly. And the numbers for trophic efficiency are pretty sobering.
They're typically around 5 to 20% with an average of just 10%.
So that means that 90% of the energy is lost at each step up the food chain.
That's a lot of energy lost.
It has huge implications for how ecosystems are structured.
Like limiting the length of food chains.
Right. You can't have too many trophic levels because there simply isn't enough energy to go around.
And it also explains why top-level carnivores are relatively rare.
They require a lot of energy, so their populations are limited by the amount of energy available at the top of the food chain.
The chapter visualizes this energy flow using energy pyramids.
Yeah. Each level of the pyramid represents a trophic level.
And the width of each level shows the amount of energy available.
You can really see how much energy is lost as you move up the pyramid.
They also show biomass pyramids, which represent the total dry mass of organisms at each trophic level.
In most terrestrial ecosystems, these pyramids also narrow towards the top.
Reflecting that energy loss,
But there are some interesting exceptions in aquatic ecosystems.
like those with phytoplankton and zooplankton.
Sometimes the zooplankton actually have a greater biomass than the phytoplankton.
Even though they're a trophic level higher.
It seems counterintuitive, but it's because the phytoplankton reproduce so quickly and are eaten so rapidly that their standing biomass remains relatively low.
Even though they're super productive.
Exactly. Now, this concept of low trophic efficiency has implications for humans as well.
Especially when it comes to food choices.
Because of all that energy loss, eating lower on the food chain is much more efficient.
So getting our calories directly from plants instead of from animals that ate plants.
Exactly. It can support a much larger human population.
Food for thought. Now, concept 55.4 delves into the cycling of chemical elements within ecosystems.
These are the biogeochemical cycles.
And these are crucial because, unlike energy, matter isn't constantly flowing into the earth from the sun.
It's a finite resource, so it has to be recycled.
And decomposers play a key role in this recycling process.
Absolutely. By breaking down dead organic matter, they release those essential elements back into the soil and water.
Making them available for producers to take up again.
The rate of decomposition is a really important factor in these cycles.
What affects the rate of decomposition?
Temperature, moisture, nutrient availability.
So warmer and wetter conditions generally lead to faster decomposition.
Exactly. That's why tropical rainforests have such rapid decomposition rates.
And very little leaf litter buildup on the forest floor.
But in colder or drier ecosystems, decomposition is much slower.
Like in peatlands, where organic matter accumulates over long periods.
Right. And this variation in decomposition rates has a big impact on where nutrients are stored in an ecosystem.
In tropical rainforests, most nutrients are tied up in the living biomass.
But in temperate forests, a significant portion is stored in the soil organic matter.
Now, these biogeochemical cycles involve both biological and geological processes,
They can be global, like for elements that exist in gaseous forms in the atmosphere.
such as carbon, oxygen, sulfur, and nitrogen.
Or they can be more localized, like for elements that don't have a significant gaseous phase.
Like phosphorus, potassium, and calcium.
The chapter provides a really helpful diagram that shows a general model of these cycles.
It highlights the major reservoirs, where elements are stored and the processes that transfer them between those reservoirs.
And then they dive into the specifics of 4 key cycles: water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus.
The water cycle is probably the most familiar to people,
It's all about evaporation, condensation, precipitation, and runoff.
driven by solar energy.
The carbon cycle is crucial because carbon is the backbone of all organic molecules.
It involves processes like photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, and the burning of fossil fuels.
The nitrogen cycle is probably the most complex.
Because nitrogen exists in so many different forms.
It involves processes like nitrogen fixation, nitrification, denitrification, and assimilation.
And then phosphorus is a bit different because it doesn't have a substantial gaseous phase.
It cycles primarily through rocks, soil, water, and organisms.
The chapter provides a really detailed breakdown of each of these cycles with diagrams and examples.
It's worth spending some time really understanding these cycles because they're so fundamental to how ecosystems function.
The chapter also features a really interesting case study from the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest.
This is a long-term research project in New Hampshire where scientists have been studying nutrient cycling in a forested watershed.
And one of their key findings was that intact forests are incredibly good at retaining nutrients.
They minimize nutrient loss through runoff,
But they also did an experiment where they deforested an entire watershed.
and the results were dramatic.
Runoff increased significantly, and there was a huge loss of nutrients from the ecosystem.
Especially nitrate, which leached into the stream at really high levels.
This study really highlighted the crucial role that vegetation plays in regulating nutrient cycles.
It's a powerful reminder of how human activities can impact ecosystem processes.
And that brings us to the final concept, restoration ecology.
This is a relatively new field that focuses on repairing damaged ecosystems.
Basically trying to help them recover to a more natural state.
And it's based on the assumption that ecological damage is at least partially reversible.
Although ecosystems do have limits to their resilience.
So the first step in restoration ecology is to identify the factors that are limiting recovery.
And then try to manipulate those factors to help the ecosystem heal itself.
Sometimes that involves physical restoration, like recontouring land that's been disturbed by mining.
Or restoring the natural flow of rivers that have been straightened or dammed.
But often it involves biological restoration, which focuses on bringing back the native plant and animal communities.
And there are two main strategies for this. Bioremediation and biological augmentation.
Bioremediation uses organisms to detoxify polluted ecosystems,
Like plants that can absorb heavy metals from contaminated soil.
or bacteria that can break down pollutants in groundwater.
Biological augmentation involves adding essential materials to an ecosystem to help it recover.
Like planting nitrogen-fixing plants in nutrient-poor soil.
Or introducing mycorrhizal fungi to help plants take up nutrients more effectively.
The chapter ends with a really nice example of the Arctic tundra as a working ecosystem.
It brings together all the concepts we've talked about, from population dynamics to energy flow to nutrient cycling.
It's a reminder of how interconnected all these ecological principles are.
So to sum up, we've explored some pretty fundamental concepts about ecosystems.
From the laws of thermodynamics to the intricacies of biogeochemical cycles.
And we've seen how human activities can both disrupt and help restore these delicate systems.
And this knowledge is so important because it helps us understand the natural world around us.
And make informed decisions about how we manage our planet's resources.
It's not just about science, it's about our future.
Now we want to leave you with a final thought.
Given all that we've learned about the interconnectedness of ecosystems and the various ways human actions can impact them,
What do you see as the most crucial challenge in achieving a sustainable balance between human needs and the long-term health of our planet's ecosystems?
think about the examples we've discussed like nutrient pollution, habitat loss, and climate change.
How do you see these issues playing out in your own community or in the world at large?
We encourage you to continue exploring these fascinating topics.
And if this deep dive sparked any new insights or questions for you, we'd love to hear about them.
Thanks for joining us on this exploration of ecosystems.
See you next time.